In 2012, an elderly man named Samuel Little, frail and wheelchair-bound, was arrested for a minor drug charge in a homeless shelter in Kentucky. Little had been on the radar of law enforcement for decades, but it wasn't until his arrest on a narcotics charge that investigators discovered the chilling truth: Samuel Little was the most prolific serialer the United States had ever seen. From 1970 to 2005, Little moved from state to state, leaving a trail of murdered women behind him. He would go undetected for over 40 years, killing at least 93 victims. That number alone is more than the combined toll of infamous killers like Ted Bundy, Gary Ridgway, and the Zodiac Killer. What really happened with the victims of Little? How did a man like Little manage to slip through the cracks of law enforcement for so long despite his numerous run-ins with the law? And perhaps most disturbingly, what could drive a man to take so many lives like that? This is the story of Samuel Little, a man whose reign of terror shocked the world and left countless questions unanswered. Samuel Little's distorted origins. Samuel McDowell Little was born into abandonment. On June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, his mother, Bessie Mae Little, was only 16 years old and incarcerated at the time of his birth. Family accounts suggest that his great-grandmother, who assisted with the delivery, refused to name him. There were whispers that he should not have survived. Bessie Mae reportedly attempted to end the pregnancy using unsafe methods, but failed. Soon after his birth, she left him by the side of a dirt road. Raised by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio, Samuel grew up without nurturing or stability. He never knew his father. Samuel was, by most accounts, invisible. As early as kindergarten, Samuel began displaying deeply concerning behavior. He became fixated on the movement of women's necks, particularly while they spoke or swallowed. A teacher's simple gesture of touching her own throat triggered an intense internal response. By third grade, he believed a girl touching his neck was a sign, validating something that had already taken root in his mind. His fascination soon became entwined with imagery. He sought out old crime magazines and storybooks filled with sensationalized illustrations of danger and violence. Over time, he began harming small animals, mimicking the images he had seen. He would later admit to doing this not out of anger, but curiosity and control. Academically, he was frequently disruptive, involved in fights, and increasingly isolated. At 14, he was sent to the Ohio Boys Industrial School, a reform institution for youth with delinquent behavior. While there, he endured repeated mistreatment, forced punishment drills, physical intimidation, and emotional degradation. His time there left scars that deepened his withdrawal and hardened his responses to others. At age 16, Samuel was arrested for breaking and entering and sent to the Ohio State Reformatory. When released nearly 2 years later, no one came for him. Later, upon learning that his biological father was someone he had grown up believing was his older sibling, he lost control and nearly harmed his grandfather. He immediately broke down in distress afterward. In these institutions, Samuel developed two skills that would follow him throughout his life: boxing and portrait drawing. He called himself a prize fighter, proud of the strength in his hands. He also honed an uncanny ability to draw human faces from memory, something that would later be used in criminal investigations. Between 1957 and 1975, Samuel was arrested at least 26 times across 11 states for crimes including theft, assault, and unlawful behavior involving others. Despite his growing record, he spent very little time behind bars. During this period, he met Aurelia Jean Dorsey, a woman he would refer to as his long-time partner. The two traveled together for years. Authorities would later speculate that she may have been more than a companion, possibly a witness, or even an enabler. Emotionally, Samuel carried unresolved wounds. He often spoke about feeling unwanted and unseen. "I loved women, but they never loved me back." He described his actions not as cruelty, but as a kind of twisted compassion. Arrest, investigation, and the truth that followed. For decades, Samuel Little drifted across America like a shadow. He rarely stayed in one place, left no clear pattern, and chose victims society too often overlooked. His crimes were brutal, but quiet. That silence was broken in September 2012, when Little was arrested at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, on a narcotics charge out of California. At 72, he appeared frail, diabetic, and wheelchair-bound, a man easily dismissed. But a standard DNA swab taken by the LAPD would unravel one of the most chilling criminal cases in US history. Within weeks, his DNA matched unsolved murders in Los Angeles from the late 1980s. All 3 victims were women who had been strangled, their cases long cold due to lack of physical evidence. Detective Mitzi Roberts, head of the LAP Cold Case Special Section, had spent years pushing to re-examine old forensic samples. Her persistence paid off. In April 2012, the lab results named a suspect Samuel Little. It wasn't the first time he had been suspected. Little had a staggering criminal history, nearly 100 arrests between 1957 and 2005, for charges including theft, assault, rape, and attempted murder. Yet he had served only about 10 years behind bars in total. Many survivors had come forward, but their accounts, credible and clear, were often ignored because of who they were: women with addiction histories, women on the margins. After his extradition to California, Little was interrogated. He denied everything, calmly, without hesitation. For 6 more years, nothing changed. Then came James Holland, a Texas Ranger known for his unmatched ability to gain a suspect's trust. In 2018, Holland began visiting Little in prison. He approached him not with accusation, but with curiosity. He offered McDonald's meals, sketch pads, and an open ear. In return, Little began to talk. 1 murder, then 5, then dozens. Over weeks of interviews, Samuel Little confessed to the murders committed between 1970 and 2005 across 19 states. He described exact clothing, street names, what his victims ate, even the dentures worn by one woman. The detail was so specific, so unshakable, that investigators across the country began reopening dormant cases. And then came the drawings. Little sketched more than 30 portraits of unidentified victims, drawings so precise they shocked even seasoned detectives. In one case, he remembered a woman's last meal, which matched the autopsy report. In another, he recalled dentures, leading to a long missing woman's identification. The FBI released the sketches. Cold case units began matching the images to Jane Does and missing persons across the US by late 2019. Over 50 of Little's confessions had been verified. Samuel Little was no longer just a suspect. He was the most prolific serial killer in American history. And for over 40 years, he had remained free, not because he was clever, but because he targeted women no one was willing to protect. Who were the victims of Samuel Little? Samuel Little didn't choose his victims randomly. He chose them strategically. Almost all of them were women on the fringes of society: sex workers, drug users, unhoused individuals, women with mental or developmental disabilities. Many were Black or Native American. Most had little to no connection to family, no strong community presence, and no one with the power to demand justice. He once said, "I didn't go after senators or governors. I stayed in the ghetto." In that one sentence, he admitted exactly how he evaded detection for so long, by preying on those whom the world already ignored. He offered them a ride, sometimes food or drugs, and once they were alone, he would strike. In most cases, he knocked them unconscious with a sudden punch. He was a trained boxer, then strangled them slowly, methodically. He never used weapons. No knife, no rope, no gun, just his hands. The absence of visible ends often led coroners to misclassify the cause of death, labeling them as overdoses or accidental deaths. This allowed Little to operate in silence, killing for decades without serious scrutiny. In 1970, Mary Brosley was likely his first victim, a 33-year-old woman in Miami. She had fallen out of touch with her family and was trying to start over. She met Little at a bar on New Year's Eve. They left together. He strangled her and dumped her body. It wasn't identified for over 40 years. 14-year-old Carlin Jones, murdered in Louisiana in 1978, may have been the youngest. Little lured her by pretending he knew her mother. He admitted to selecting her specifically because she was young and isolated. No one reported her missing. In 1982, Patricia Ann Mount, a developmentally disabled woman, was seen dancing with Little in a Florida bar. Several witnesses saw them leave together. Her body was found not long after. Witnesses testified, but because they were sex workers or users, their statements were dismissed as unreliable. The case was dropped. Only decades later, after Little confessed, was she finally believed. Melinda Lepre, also in 1982, was last seen getting into Little's car. Several women in Pascagoula had reported him for assaulting them, but again, the authorities declined to prosecute. Her murder, like so many others, went unsolved until Little talked. He didn't always succeed in killing. Some women survived. In 1980, Helda Nelson was attacked in a motel room. Little had wrapped her scarf around her neck when someone knocked on the door. He calmly told the person she'd be out in a minute, then left. Hilda survived. She reported the incident. No action was taken. In 1984, Lori Barrows survived a vicious attack in San Diego. Little tied her up, strangled her, and left her in a remote location. She crawled to a payphone and called for help. She gave police a detailed account of what happened, including his physical description and vehicle. But again, no one followed up. Her credibility was questioned due to her drug use. Even in death, his victims were often denied attention. Carol Offer, 1987, and Guadalupe Padaca, 1989, were found strangled in Los Angeles. At the time, the cases received little media coverage. Only years later, when Little's DNA was matched to evidence collected from their bodies, were these women's names finally tied to a serial killer. Some of his victims weren't who the public expected. Sonia Kett Austin, a mother of 4, had no criminal history. She was killed in 1987. Her murder shattered the myth that only women in high-risk lifestyles were in danger. For Little, it was about access and invisibility. And in that moment, she was vulnerable. In many cases, Little remembered chillingly specific details: what the women wore, what they ate, how they spoke. He even recalled one woman's dentures and another's final meal, facts later verified through autopsy and evidence. He memorialized them in sketches, over 30 portraits drawn from memory, each one focused on the face and neck. Those were the parts he fixated on. Those were the parts he claimed to love. Despite being arrested nearly 100 times in 11 different states, Little was never connected to a murder until 2012. Why? Because law enforcement agencies didn't communicate. Because coroners failed to see signs of foul play. Because prosecutors declined to pursue cases where victims were marginalized. And because the world looked away. Trial and aftermath. The trial began on August 18, 2014, in Los Angeles. Prosecutor Beth Silverman presented the case with clarity and conviction. She walked the jury through the DNA evidence, the striking similarities across the murders, and the powerful testimonies of survivors like Lori Barrows and Hilda Nelson. Their voices, ignored for decades, were finally being heard in a court of law. On August 24, the jury found Samuel Little guilty of all 3 murders. A month later, on September 25, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, the families of the victims finally had their moment. Audrey Nelson's daughter stood before the court and said, "All I ever wanted was my mom. Instead of saying hello and hugging her, I had to say goodbye." It was a moment that laid bare the deep and lasting pain caused by Little's crimes and by the years of silence that followed them. Still, Little refused to take responsibility. He denied all charges and called the verdict a state-sponsored execution based on lies. But the jury believed the evidence, and so did the nation. In 2018, during a visit from Texas Ranger James Holland, a deal was offered. If Little fully cooperated, he would not face the death penalty. It was a calculated trade, not for mercy, but for the truth. Little admitted he wasn't afraid of prison, but he feared dying by lethal injection. That fear became the key to unlocking decades of secrets. In exchange for his cooperation, several states, including Texas, Florida, Mississippi, and Ohio, agreed not to pursue capital punishment. Samuel Little died on December 30, 2020, at the California State Prison in Los Angeles County. He was 80 years old. The official cause of death was listed as complications from diabetes, heart failure, and multiple other chronic health conditions. At the time of his death, dozens of his victims remained unidentified. Dozens of families were still waiting for answers. He died with a full belly and no remorse. But the stories he tried to erase, the women he believed no one would ever remember, are finally being told. His confessions brought closure to some, anguish to many, and a stark reminder to all of how long the system looked the other way. Compared to other serial killers like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, or Richard Ramirez, Samuel Little was strikingly different. He didn't kill for fame, didn't leave theatrical signatures, and never taunted the police or media. He wasn't seeking recognition. He operated in silence, without spectacle, and that silence made him even more dangerous. While others sought notoriety, Little sought invisibility, and he found it. So the question remains, why did he kill? Was it lust? Power control? Or was it something more hollow, a deep, insatiable emptiness masked by delusions of compassion? He once said he Help them move on. Help to. From what? These weren't acts of mercy, they were acts of control, built on predation and calculated erasure. What the Samuel Little case teaches us is painfully clear. When a society decides who is worth listening to and who isn't, it creates the perfect hiding place for evil. Little didn't just rely on darkness, he relied on indifference. His victims weren't forgotten because they were unloved. They were forgotten because no one with power bothered to remember them. Justice should never be selective. It must extend to everyone, especially those the world ignores. If we allow the forgotten to remain voiceless, we open the door for more predators like him to thrive. Samuel Little didn't just expose the horror of his crimes, he exposed the silence that let them happen. And that silence is ours to break. Seattle, Washington, summer of 1982. They began discovering bodies floating along the banks of the Green River. Young women, some barely more than girls, were vanishing off the streets. One by one, the number of the murder was so many that their names faded from memory, replaced by case numbers and autopsy reports. As the investigation unfolded, they called the figure behind this series the Green River Killer. However, this killer wasn't a criminal genius. He was Gary Leon Ridgway, a quiet, unremarkable truck painter with an IQ of just 82. And yet, this seemingly forgettable man became the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history, with at least 48 confirmed victims, and possibly over 90. For nearly 2 decades, Ridgway evaded capture while living a normal suburban life, married, employed, unnoticed. He slipped through the hands of detectives, beat lie detectors, and even outlasted the massive Green River Task Force, a specialized unit formed solely to track him down. That task force then was dismantled in disgrace and criticism. What kind of hatred or obsession drove a man to take the lives of so many people, then come home and eat dinner as if nothing happened? What exactly did he do to his victims after they were dead? And what could make this evil tear down? This is the story of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. The murders formed the Green River Killer. On July 15th, the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield was found floating in the Green River near Kent, Washington. She was a runaway and a known sex worker. Within days, investigators recovered a second victim, Jaceel Ann Lovehorn, age 17, whose decomposed body was found near the airport. Then came more. Deborah Bonner, age 22, and Marcia Chapman, age 31, were found in the same area, nude and dumped in shallow water. Chapman's body had been pinned down with heavy river rocks. Ligature marks around their necks confirmed what investigators feared: someone was hunting women, and doing it with calculated cruelty. On August 15th, 2 more victims, Cynthia Hins, age 17, and Opal Mills, age 16, were discovered near the same stretch of river. That brought the body count to 6, all within a 1-mile radius, in just over a month. Public panic began to spread. The victims were all young, vulnerable, and lived on the margins. Police, under increasing pressure, began looking for patterns and a suspect. The media gave the unknown killer a name: the Green River Killer. Investigators noted the disturbing similarities. All the victims were sex workers or runaways, all had been strangled, and all were dumped near the Green River. Theories started to form. Was the killer a truck driver, a local with deep knowledge of the area? The Green River Task Force was established, a team of over 25 officers dedicated solely to catching this man. But as quickly as bodies appeared, leads vanished. The killer was precise, disciplined, and always one step ahead. Between 1982 and 1985, Gary Ridgway would go on to kill at least 40 more women. The victims were strikingly similar. Most were between the ages of 16 and 22. Nearly all were sex workers, drug users, or homeless, women whose disappearances drew little attention. They were picked up along Pacific Highway South, or in Seattle's red light zones, then strangled, often with their own clothing. Many were dumped nude or partially clothed in wooded areas, near the river, or around the airport. Some were posed in disturbing positions. The list of victims grew rapidly. In total, Gary Ridgway would plead guilty to 48 murders, but in taped interviews, he claimed the number could be as high as 71, or even more than 90. Most chilling of all, many of the women he confessed to killing were never found, and never identified. Here are the confirmed victims. Gary Ridgway specifically targeted sex workers and runaways because he believed they were the easiest to kill and they were the least likely to be missed by police. In his own words, they were easy to pick up and easy to kill. Many of these women lived on the fringes of society, struggling with homelessness, addiction, or estranged families. Their disappearances often went unnoticed for days, even weeks. Ridgway knew that law enforcement wasn't prioritizing missing person cases involving sex workers, and that gave him confidence to keep killing. He once chillingly stated, "They wouldn't be missed. No one cared." He made himself appear harmless, soft-spoken, ordinary, even polite. Some victims got into his truck thinking he was a paying client. Sometimes, he even showed the photo of his young son with him to make the women feel safer. Once they were isolated, usually in a wooded area or near the river, he would attack. After engaging in sex, he would strangle them, usually with their own clothing like underwear or shoelaces. In some cases, he used his bare hands. He later admitted that he enjoyed watching them die, describing the moment they stopped moving as a kind of release. It was a pattern he repeated dozens of times, with chilling precision. How Gary Ridgway outsmarted the cops. Gary Ridgway may have had a low IQ, reportedly just 82, but when it came to evading capture, he was disturbingly clever. He studied how detectives approached crime scenes, adjusted his behavior accordingly, and made himself nearly invisible. He never left obvious evidence. He never kept trophies like the other killers. He never bragged. Instead, he blended into society, a married man with a steady job, living in a modest home in the suburbs. Early in the investigation, Ridgway even passed a polygraph test and cooperated just enough with detectives to appear helpful without revealing anything meaningful. That small act of calculated compliance made him seem cooperative, exactly what a killer wouldn't be. It threw them off, and it worked. Ridgway was obsessive about cleaning. He scrubbed down his pickup truck after every murder, so meticulously that it bordered on OCD-level compulsion. He burned victims' clothes or tossed them into donation bins. To throw investigators off, he sometimes planted random objects, like someone else's chewing gum or cigarette butts, at dump sites. He never used weapons that could be traced and made sure no souvenirs ended up in his home. He dumped bodies in remote wooded areas, riverbanks, or construction zones, often in clusters. But he also moved some remains later to confuse police, deliberately spacing them out to obscure patterns. In at least one case, he even transported a victim across state lines, complicating jurisdiction. But his most horrifying secret, necrophilia. Ridgway admitted returning to the dump sites to have sex with the corpses, repeating the act until decomposition made it impossible. In his own words, having sex with them after they were dead saved money. No arguing, no fighting, no saying no. He killed during lunch breaks, returned to work as if nothing happened, and even brought his young son during pick-ups to appear harmless. He once used the same dump site multiple times, knowing police had already been there. He wasn't lucky, he was cold, calculated, and terrifyingly methodical. And that's how Gary Ridgway, the most prolific serial killer in US history, stayed ahead of one of the biggest task forces in American law enforcement for nearly 20 years. A 19-year hunt for the Green River Killer. The Green River case officially began in 1982, but the earliest known contact between Gary Ridgway and law enforcement actually happened 2 years earlier. In 1980, he was arrested after a sex worker accused him of choking her. Ridgway admitted to the incident but claimed she had bitten him first. The police accepted his explanation and released him without charges. Then in 1982, he was arrested again, this time for soliciting sex from an undercover female officer posing as a prostitute. Once again, no further action was taken, and Ridgway quietly faded from scrutiny. As the bodies of women began surfacing along the Green River, police launched an aggressive investigation. Between 1982 and 1984, they interviewed 200 individuals, ranging from sex workers to cab drivers, motel staff, and local pimps. But despite this effort, no solid leads emerged. Ridgway's name came up repeatedly in police records because he frequently hired sex workers. But since that behavior was so common among many men in the area, detectives saw his presence in the reports as typical rather than suspicious, allowing him to blend in and avoid serious scrutiny. In April 1983, the investigation came dangerously close to solving the case. Marie Malvar, one of the victims, was last seen getting into a pickup truck with patches of primer paint. Her boyfriend followed the truck and traced it to Ridgway's home. Police visited the house and spoke with Ridgway, but when he confidently explained that he had nothing to do with her disappearance, they left. In reality, he had already killed Marie and burned the scratches she had left on his arms with battery acid to eliminate any trace of DNA. Despite being a prime suspect, he was not placed under surveillance or detained. In 1984, Ridgway executed a bold and strategic move. He called the police himself. Offering to help with the investigation, he even volunteered to take a polygraph test. Amazingly, he passed. That single act, along with his mild demeanor and willingness to cooperate, caused investigators to lower their suspicions significantly. His name remained in reports, but he continued to blend in as just another working-class man who occasionally hired sex workers. The real breakthrough came in 1986 when a woman survived an attack and later reported that her assailant matched Ridgway's description. This prompted Lieutenant Matt Haney to re-examine past files and place Ridgway at the top of the suspect list. A search warrant was issued for Ridgway's home, vehicles, and work locker. Unfortunately, no incriminating physical evidence was found. Ridgway had meticulously cleaned his property and removed anything that could connect him to the crimes. However, investigators may collect a saliva sample, an action that would prove vital years later. Between 1988 and 2000, the case grew cold. Only 2 additional bodies were discovered, possibly by a copycat, and Ridgway continued living a normal life. He remarried, kept his job as a truck painter, and remained under the radar. The Green River Task Force was drastically reduced in size, and the media criticized the investigation's lack of progress. Notably, at that time, they finally tried to get advice from the killers themselves. One they got was the serial killer Ted Bundy. He offered behavioral insights from prison, suggesting that the killer might return to the bodies to commit necrophilic acts. Despite this disturbing but accurate insight, police were never able to act on it in time. Everything changed in 2001. Advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to retest the sample collected from Ridgway back in 1987. The results were conclusive evidence found on at least 4 victims. In November of that year, Gary Ridgway was arrested, ending a 19-year manhunt. How the early life of Gary Ridgway went wrong. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. The middle child in deeply dysfunctional household, his father, a bus driver, frequently ranted about sex workers, calling them disgusting, yet was known to visit them himself. His mother, Mary Ridgway, was domineering, emotionally abusive, and inappropriately involved in Gary's private development. Even into his teenage years, she would bathe him after he wet the bed, often scrubbing him roughly, focusing on the dirtiest parts. These acts, both humiliating and confusing, seeded a warped mix of maternal resentment and sexual obsession. Gary later confessed to having violent sexual fantasies involving his mother, including imagining strangling her during intercourse. This intense Oedipal conflict would haunt his psyche for decades. Ridgway also exhibited key traits of the McDonald triad, a psychological file linked to violent tendencies. He wet the bed into his teens and tortured animals. He was known to shoot birds with a BB gun for fun. But more disturbingly, Ridgway once killed a cat by placing it inside a freezer. He also showed early signs of fire setting. His IQ was measured at just 80, placing him near the borderline of intellectual disability. He failed 2 school grades and was teased relentlessly. He was nicknamed slow and terrified of being labeled special needs. After marrying his high school sweetheart, Ridgway joined the U.S. Navy and was deployed to Southeast Asia during the Vietnam era. There, he began soliciting sex from local prostitutes and contracted gonorrhea, a disease he blamed entirely on the women, deepening his misogynistic rage. That hatred would follow him home. His second marriage, to a woman named Marcia, ended in betrayal. She cheated on him repeatedly, and Ridgway later described the humiliation as devastating. He admitted that it made him feel worthless and disrespected as a man. This emotional wound became another fuel source for his growing hatred of women. Despite his bitterness, Ridgway remained addicted to paid sex. He continued seeking out prostitutes, all while silently seeing them as disposable. Psychologically, Ridgway fits multiple disorders: antisocial personality disorder, paraphilic disorders including necrophilia, and a profound misogynistic moral contradiction. He maintained a normal, public image: quiet, religious, Hardworking, married multiple times, while secretly murdering dozens of women. His lack of empathy, ability to lie easily, and long-term manipulation of police and family members show a chilling mastery of deception. In taped interviews, Ridgway admitted that his killings were both sexual release and symbolic revenge. "I killed them like I wanted to kill my wife." Each victim became a stand-in, a projection of the mother who confused him, the wife who betrayed him, and the sex workers he resented yet needed. Arrest, confession, and trial. On November 30, 2001, Gary Ridgway was quietly arrested in the parking lot of Kenworth, the truck company where he worked. Officers had been waiting with a warrant, armed with new DNA evidence linking him to the early Green River murders. When confronted, Ridgway didn't resist. He showed no emotion, no fear, no confusion, no anger. Once in custody, Gary Ridgway carefully crafted his interrogation strategy to avoid the death penalty while maintaining control. From the outset, he agreed to confess in exchange for a life sentence, offering just enough information to seem cooperative without revealing everything. This made it harder to link him to specific cases without DNA evidence, and it helped him appear less personally involved. When asked if he believed he could kill as many women as he wanted without being caught, he simply replied, "Yes." Realizing the strength of the DNA evidence and the potential for a death sentence, Ridgway's attorneys proposed a deal in exchange for avoiding execution. He would plead guilty and help locate the bodies. Prosecutors accepted. They had conclusive evidence for only 7 murders, but families of dozens more women needed answers. The plea deal guaranteed Ridgway would never walk free, and might help bring closure to those who had waited nearly 20 years. In taped confessions, Ridgway admitted to killing at least 71 women. He initially pleaded guilty to 48 counts of first-degree murder. At the sentencing hearing, the names of all 48 confirmed victims were read aloud, one by one. After each name, Ridgway answered the same way, "Guilty." The process took over an hour. Family members wept. Some screamed, others trembled with rage. The judge handed down 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 480 additional years for evidence tampering. Though Washington state still had the death penalty, the plea deal ensured Ridgway would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Before being taken away, Judge Richard Jones forced Ridgway to face the families of his victims. One final confrontation that filled the courtroom with raw pain and bitter silence. "You're an animal. You deserve to burn in hell for what you did to my daughter. Look at me, you piece of garbage. You don't even have the guts to face what you did." Despite the furious outbursts from the victims' families, for most of the sentencing, Ridgway sat motionless, his face blank, cold, and expressionless, just as he had been during his long, emotionless confessions. But then, a man named Robert Rule, the father of 16-year-old Linda Jane Rule, one of Ridgway's youngest victims, stepped up to the microphone. But instead of anger, he spoke with compassion. "Mr. Ridgway, there are people here who hate you. I'm not one of them. You've made it difficult to live up to what I believe. But I believe in forgiveness, and I forgive you." At that moment, Ridgway broke down. The man who had shown no remorse in hundreds of hours of interviews began to cry, his face trembling, his shoulders shaking. For a man who had inflicted so much pain, it wasn't rage that cracked him open, it was compassion. Even after sentencing, Ridgway continued cooperating. He led investigators to more remains, helping solve decades-old disappearances. In 2010, he pleaded guilty to the murder of Becky Marrero, bringing his known victim count to 49. Even decades after his arrest, investigators believe there are still victims who have never been found, and families who may never receive closure. The Green River case stands as a haunting reminder of how easily society can overlook the vulnerable. Ridgway targeted women on the margins, sex workers, runaways, those without strong social support because he believed no one would come looking for them. And for years, he was right. But this case also shows the power of persistence. It was not a breakthrough moment that brought Ridgway to justice. It was 19 years of work, evolving forensic science, and the tireless effort of investigators who refused to give up. Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: every life matters. No one deserves to be forgotten. And justice, even when long delayed, still matters, not only to punish the guilty, but to give voice to the silenced. The Green River victims were more than numbers. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and they deserved better. Wichita, Kansas, January 15, 1974. At 8 a.m., 3 children return home from school early due to illness. What they find inside will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The house is silent. Too silent. Then 4 bodies. Their mother, father, and 2 siblings, all bound, all murdered. The killer left no fingerprints. No forced entry. No clear motive. Just 2 things: a brutal method and a message to come. More frightening, this is the beginning of a killing spree that would last nearly 2 decades. 10 confirmed victims. Hundreds of taunts to police. A nickname burned into American horror: BTK, bind, torture, kill. And it belongs to a man, Dennis Rader. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. Unlike most serial killers, Dennis Rader wasn't molded by any pain or regret from the past. Ted Bundy, abused and discarded. John Wayne Gacy, brutalized as a child. Jeffrey Dahmer, warped by loneliness and rejection. But Dennis Rader? He had a stable upbringing, loving parents, a quiet life. So the question is, what drove him killing? Was he a pure evil? And how a pure evil really did his job? This is the story of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer. Early life and psychology origins. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and raised in Wichita. He was raised 4 boys in what appeared to be a stable, working-class family. His father, a former Marine, worked long hours at the gas company. His mother was a grocery store bookkeeper. Though the home was free of overt violence or poverty, both parents were frequently absent. Rader would later describe a deep sense of emotional neglect, especially from his mother, which festered into silent resentment and a growing detachment from normal emotional connection. By the age of 10 or 11, around 5th or 6th grade, Rader had already begun experiencing disturbing sexual fantasies. He was drawn to visions of bondage and domination, especially involving women being tied up and helpless. These weren't fleeting thoughts. He described them as fantasy shows he directed in his mind, returning to them again and again. He would masturbate to imagined scenes of captured women, often substituting reality with a world he completely controlled. One memory stood out, seeing his mother accidentally trap her hand in a sofa's metal frame. Instead of rushing to help, young Dennis felt a surge of excitement, power over a trapped, vulnerable figure. This blend of helplessness and control became the blueprint for his later crimes. As most kids played in the streets or made friends, Rader to prowling through backyards, peeking into windows. He began killing small animals, cats and dogs, strangling or hanging them in secret. These acts of cruelty weren't about rage, they were practice. During his teenage years, Rader joined the Boy Scouts, where he learned how to tie knots, move silently, and observe others. Ironically, this experience would equip him with the skills he'd later use as a killer. He became fixated on his own genitalia, even naming his penis Sparky. When aroused, he called it Big Sparky Time, a disturbing peek at the obsessive and juvenile sexual mindset. In adulthood, Rader served in the U.S. Air Force from 1966 to 1970. During this time, his fantasies escalated. He began breaking into women's homes to steal underwear, spying on them as they undressed. Yet to the outside world, Dennis Rader was nothing more than a quiet serviceman. After the military, he returned to Kansas, married Paula Dietz in 1971, and had 2 children. He worked at a grocery store, studied engineering, and later criminal justice. In every sense, he was normal. A father, a churchgoer. No one suspected that the man eating dinner with his family was mentally rehearsing murder. Then, in 1973, everything changed. After being fired from his job at the Cessna Aircraft Company, Rader found himself with time and no supervision. This moment became a turning point. With fewer responsibilities, his fantasies became plans. He began categorizing potential victims as projects, spending days or weeks watching their routines. It's clear that Dennis Rader didn't need trauma to become a monster. His fantasies didn't come from abuse or fear, they came from within, and no one noticed. No one stopped him. Then he lost his job. Left with time and no structure, the fantasies turned into plans. The murders, autoerotic bondage. Between 1974 and 1991, Dennis Rader carried out 10 murders with disturbing precision. Each victim was chosen, stalked, and killed according to a personal code he developed over years of obsessive fantasizing. Each murder was methodically planned. Rader referred to his victims as projects. His preparation followed a 4-phase ritual. Trolling is scouting for victims. Stalking is scudding for routines. The hit phase is the kill itself, and cooling off is returning to his normal life. It was a cold Kansas morning when 15-year-old Charlie Otero returned home from school and opened the door to his worst nightmare. Inside, he found his parents, Joseph and Julie Otero, lying lifeless on the floor, his little brother Joseph Juder, dead nearby. But the most haunting sight was in the basement. 11-year-old Josephine, hanged by a rope, her body partially undressed, a plastic bag over her head, her hands tied. Her innocence was stolen. He had broken into the house through the back door, expecting only the mother and children. But when the father turned out to be home, he changed the plan. He tied them all, tried to calm them, told them he was just a thief, but after everything went wrong, he tied all 4 of them in a bedroom. Then, one by one, he strangled them, using cords, ropes, and plastic bags. He hanged 11-year-old Josephine in the basement. She was posed. Rader later admitted to masturbating near her body, satisfied with the performance of his fantasy. It was his first murder, and it was everything he had imagined. In April 1974, Rader broke into the Bright home and waited. When Catherine, 21 years old, arrived with her brother Kevin, Rader forced them at gunpoint to tie each other. He tried to kill both. Catherine fought hard, but Rader overpowered her. He strangled her, then stabbed her repeatedly. She bled to death while he fled. March 17, 1977. Using a fake story, Rader gained entry into Shirley Vion's home, while her 3 young children were present. He calmed them, locked a bathroom with blankets and toys, then turned to their mother. He tied her to the bed and strangled her with a rope. He didn't rush. He followed his routine. December 8, 1977, Rader selected Nancy Fox, 25 years old, through stalking. He waited inside her home, then confronted her directly. He told her he had a sexual problem, tied her hands and feet, undressed to a certain degree, and strangled her with a belt. After she stopped moving, he masturbated in the room, completing what he considered a successful project. April 27, 1985, Rader broke in the home of Maureen Hedge, 53 years old, late at night. After killing her by manual strangulation, he took her body with him. He brought her to his church, where he posed the corpse in various bondage positions and took photographs using a Polaroid camera. He then disposed of the body and returned to daily life. September 16, 1986, disguised as a telephone repairman, Rader entered 28-year-old Vicky Wiggerle's home during daylight. He asked to check the phone line, then pulled a gun and forced her to the bedroom. She resisted violently. He overpowered her, tied her, and strangled her with a nylon stocking. Afterward, he rearranged her clothes and took several quick photos. January 19, 1991, Rader broke a patio window to enter 62-year-old Dolores Davis's home. He tied her up using pantyhose and strangled her. He then wrapped her body in a blanket, loaded it into her own car, and drove to a secluded area where he dumped it. In the days that followed, he returned to photograph the body and retrieve items he had left behind. In every murder, Rader brought a hit kit, including tape, rope, knives, plastic bags, and occasionally a camera. He studied his victims beforehand, sometimes for weeks. He planned the approach, controlled the scene, and acted out fantasies that had lived in his head since childhood. When his original plan failed, he adapted on the spot. Some of his kills were cold and silent, others were chaotic, but in all of them, one thing remained constant: Rader never acted without purpose. Each step had been imagined, rehearsed, refined, and even when he wasn't killing, he kept performing. In private, and often outdoors in remote wooded areas, abandoned buildings, or even cemeteries, he reenacted his fantasies in disturbing detail. He would dress in women's lingerie, often clothing stolen from victims or symbolic replicas, and tie himself up in the exact positions he had used on their bodies. Sometimes he used ropes, sometimes belts, pantyhose, or plastic bags. Anything that could recreate the conditions of control and helplessness that excited him. He wore female masks with exaggerated features, posed as a lifeless body, and arranged the scene himself using a Polaroid camera on a timer. In some photos, he could be seen hanging from trees, lying curled up inside garbage bags, or kneeling on cold ground with his hands bound behind his back, dressed in nightgowns or bras. He didn't simply relive the killings. He meticulously choreographed them, inserting himself into both roles, the executioner and the executed. "This is the time, big sparky time," was shouted. For Rader, this was more than fetish. It was a ritual. Power. How the BTK Killer got caught. After his last murder in 1991, Dennis Rader vanished. He called this period his phase out, a time when he no longer needed to kill, not because of guilt, but because he was still feeding off the past. During those years, he continued writing detailed journals, documenting each project, reliving every kill like a director revisiting his greatest hits. Once, at a community lunch, he found himself sips to the Wichita police chief, and later wrote how much he enjoyed knowing they had no idea. He even collected trophies, panties, photos, sketches, and kept them meticulously organized in secret compartments throughout his home. But by 2004, memory wasn't enough. Rader wanted recognition. He wanted to be feared again. On the 30th anniversary of the Oduro family murders, he sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle. Inside was a photocopy of Vicky Wagrel's driver's license, an item never made public. It was his first contact in over a decade, and it wouldn't be the last. Over the next 11 months, Rader sent at least 11 packages to the media and police. They included poems, diagrams, trinkets, and grotesque items like cereal boxes with bound dolls meant to represent Josephine Oduro. One letter included a disturbing titled, "Oh Death to Nancy." Another came with a story draft titled, "The BTK Story." Chapter 1. An autobiographical manifesto in which he painted himself as a tragic anti-hero. He signed these packages, BTK Strangler, and created twisted graphic logos using rope and cross imagery, twisted symbols of death and domination. Rader wanted to be remembered, like Bundy, like Berkowitz. He wasn't chasing justice, he was chasing celebrity. Then came the mistake. In one of his letters, Rader asked police a floppy disk, "Can it be traced?" The Wichita police responded via newspaper addy, "No, it's safe." And Rader, ever the narcissist, believed them. He sent the disk. Inside, the metadata revealed the file name sermon.doc. It had last been modified by a user named Dennis on a computer registered to Christ Lutheran Church. Investigators connected the dots. Dennis Rader, a man at that time was a church council president, a city enforcement officer, a Boy Scout leader, was suddenly a suspect. To confirm their suspicion, they secretly obtained a DNA sample from a pap smear once collected from his daughter. The DNA matched semen found under Vicky Wagrel's fingernails. It was a perfect match. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested from his home. Calm and almost smug, he looked at the officers and said, "I just have one question, why now?" Even in custody, he tried to preserve control. "I was doing okay, I had this under control." As if murder was just a bad habit he had finally learned to manage. The purposeful ending. 24 hours of his arrest, Dennis Rader confessed to all 10 murders. He spoke calmly and methodically, offering details without remorse, almost as if he was proud to finally share the full story. You can tell when the eyes lose the sparkle. That's when the fantasy clicks into place. He scored himself on each murder. Nancy Fox was perfect. Catherine Bright was failure, too much struggle. When asked why he had resumed contact with police after 13 years of silence, his answer was simple. "I wanted people to remember. BTK deserved credit." He explained the cereal boxes, the bound dolls, the poetry, the diskettes. He revealed how he had designed the BTK Strangler logo. He showed no shame, only pride. He even led detectives to hidden boxes around his home and neighborhood, containing photos, notes, victim IDs, sketches, fantasy scripts, and trophies. Items no one had found for decades. And then, in perhaps the most haunting detail, he revealed his failed projects. Women who unknowingly came within inches of death. One of them was Anna Williams, a 63-year-old widow living alone. Rader had stalked her for weeks, learned her schedule, drawn diagrams of her home. One night in 1979, he broke in, waited for hours, but she never returned. Enraged yet still obsessed, he later mailed her a package containing a poem, bondage illustrations, and stolen items from her home, along with a chilling message. "You escaped me this time." Another aborted mission was what he called Project Green. In that case, he had chosen a young woman, tracked her routine, and prepared to strike. But at the last moment, a family member unexpectedly arrived, and he aborted the plan. He kept notes, sketches, and coded references to her in his journals, proof that, even without blood, the fantasy had still taken shape. To Rader, these women weren't just missed opportunities. They were still his. On June 27, 2005, Rader formally pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. When the judge asked if these were voluntary admissions, Rader replied, "Yes, sir." I had the control. And I enjoyed it. He then proceeded to recount each murder in front of the court in chilling detail. Not once did his voice tremble. Not once did he pause to apologize. On August 18, 2005, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, a minimum of 175 years in prison. Kansas had no death penalty at the time of the crimes, and thus, he would live, but never walk free again. In his final statement, Rader offered the courtroom a twisted version of remorse. "I'm sorry, but it's just a fantasy that got out of control. I have regrets. But it's not enough." The family members of the victims sobbed. Some stormed out. Others stared in disbelief as this man, so calm, so structured, described how he ended their loved ones' lives like someone explaining a recipe. Rader was placed in El Dorado Correctional Facility, Kansas. He is kept in segregation, locked in a 2x3-meter cell for 23 hours a day. He eats alone, reads alone, breathes alone. He still signs letters under the alias Bill Thomas Killman, a twisted acronym still spelling BTK. He once complained that the food doesn't enough protein. He keeps writing, keeps analyzing. According to those who monitor him, he continues to show traits of narcissism. He believes he still matters. In the years following his arrest, criminal psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland conducted over 5 years of interviews with Rader. Her conclusion: he was not insane. He was disturbingly structured. Diagnosed disorders and traits include narcissistic personality disorder, an inflated sense of self-importance, an obsession with legacy, constant need for attention, antisocial need personality disorder, a lack of empathy, remorse, or moral code, manipulative and deceitful over decades, obsessive, compulsive personality traits, an extreme need for control and order, detailed record-keeping, ritualistic behavior. He was also diagnosed with paraphilic disorders including sexual sadism arousal from inflicting pain and witnessing suffering, fetishism, sexual fixation on women's clothing, particularly underwear, transvestic fetishism, pleasure from dressing in female garments, autoerotic asphyxiation, tying himself up, simulating death, and masturbating while wearing masks and lingerie. His daughter, Carrie Rawson, wrote a best-selling memoir in 2019, A Serial Killer's Daughter. She recounted growing up with a father who prayed, taught her to fish, attended church, and who secretly tortured and murdered strangers. She has cut off all contact with him. Rader's case has since inspired dozens of documentaries, podcasts, and TV shows. He is studied in criminal psychology classes as the prototype of the organized killer, a man who weaponized normalcy. Dennis Rader wanted to be remembered, and he got exactly what he wanted, but not as a man of control, as a man of cowardice, cruelty, and careful lies. Forever. Rader reminds us that not all monsters are forged in fire. Some are built in silence, through unchecked fantasies, growing obsessions, and the absence of early psychological intervention. We must shift the conversation. Not all killers look damaged. We need to pay closer attention to patterns of control, obsession, and emotional detachment, especially when paired with a lack of empathy. We must support better mental health screening, not just for the visibly struggling, but also for those who seem perfect. Not all evil comes from pain. Sometimes, it comes from silence and ignorance. On the evening of February 1, 2012, in Anchorage, Alaska, 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was working a quiet shift at her usual coffee stand. Around 8 p.m., a masked man armed with a gun approached her. He demanded that she turn off the lights, and then he climbed through the window, forcing her to leave with him without resistance. This was no random robbery, it was a well-planned abduction. On February 24, 2012, nearly a month after her disappearance, Samantha's father received a text message from Samantha's phone. The message directed him to Corner Park, where a photograph of Samantha holding a local newspaper was left. Samantha appeared to be alive in the photo, but something was off. Her eyes were unnaturally wide, and the photo was staged. Along with the photo, Kays sent a ransom note demanding $30,000, while continuing to withdraw money from Samantha's account using her ATM card. From March 1 to 10, 2012, Kays withdrew money across several states: Alaska, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. It was during this time in Texas that he made a critical mistake. Authorities, led by the Texas Rangers, noticed his white Ford Focus and connected it to the ATM transactions. They pulled him over, and during the stop, they found Samantha's ID, debit card, and phone in his car. This discovery was the break in the case that authorities had been hoping for. On March 13, 2012, Israel Keyes was arrested. Initially, investigators thought they had caught a simple kidnapper. However, during questioning, Keyes confessed to being a serial killer, revealing that he had been killing for years. This was the beginning of the shocking revelation that Israel Keyes was one of the most dangerous serial killers in recent U.S. history. This is the story of Israel Keyes, the killer no one was looking for. The early life of Israel Keyes. Israel Keyes was born in 1978 in Russman, Newton, USA, into a large, isolated family. The youngest of 12 children, Israel grew up in a home that was far from typical. His family lived in complete seclusion, away from modern conveniences such as electricity and technology. The absence of basic utilities was just the beginning of his unusual upbringing. Keyes' parents adhered to the strict and extremes of the Christian identity movement, a radical sect that propagated white supremacy and anti-Semitism. This far-right ideology, combined with their extreme religious practices, shaped Israel's early worldviews. Although Israel's family lived in isolation, the Shivy family next door became one of his few outside influences. The Shivy, like Keyes' family, lived secluded lives, and their story would later take a dark turn. In 1996, the Shivy family was involved in the brutal murders of 3 people, an event that foreshadowed the violence Israel would soon embrace. From a young age, Keyes exhibited disturbing behavior. By the age of 10, he was already involved in petty theft, arson, and animal cruelty. These early signs of violent behavior were overlooked as typical childhood mischief. As a teenager, Keyes' behavior became increasingly erratic. At 14, he displayed significant emotional and psychological disturbances, growing more detached from his peers and increasingly prone to violence. His behavior was marked by a lack of empathy and a desire to dominate and control others. The turning point came in 1996, when Israel was 18 years old. He committed his first sexual assault, a brutal attack that would shape his criminal trajectory. This act was a significant shift, transforming him from a troubled young man into a violent criminal. In 1998, Israel enlisted in the U.S. Army, a move that would provide him with both an escape from his chaotic home life and the opportunity to hone his skills. He adapted quickly to military life, impressing his superiors with his discipline and intelligence. He served a tour in Egypt and received an Army Achievement Award, excelling in his training. However, his time in the military also gave him the tools he would need to carry out his future killings. Upon leaving the Army in 2001, Keyes moved to Washington State, marking the start of a new chapter in his life, one that would be defined by a series of horrific murders. The killing spree and methodology of Israel Keyes. Israel Keyes' killing spree began in the early 2000s, after he moved to Alaska and started living what appeared to be a normal life. However, beneath this facade, he was a highly calculated serial killer. Keyes didn't have a fixed victim type. Instead, he chose his targets based on opportunity and geography, preferring isolated locations where he could carry out his crimes without being detected. His first confirmed murder occurred in 2009, but Keyes claimed to have killed long before that. During his years in Alaska, Keyes began to refine his methods. He traveled extensively across the United States, often visiting different states and even international destinations. These travels were not just for leisure. They were part of his plan to hunt victims without leaving a trail that would connect the murders. He would often kill in places far from his home to avoid suspicion and throw off investigators. Keyes was meticulous in his planning and execution. Using his extensive knowledge of the areas, he traveled to select locations where he could dispose of the bodies without anyone noticing. One of the most chilling aspects of Keyes' methodology was his use of kill kits. These were carefully prepared sets of tools, including weapons, restraints, and other equipment, which he buried in remote locations across the country. He hid these kits in places he knew he would visit, allowing him to carry out his murders without needing to bring anything with him. This also minimized the risk of being caught with incriminating evidence. The kits were scattered across various states, ensuring that Keyes could commit his crimes at will, without the need for extensive preparation each time. Keyes's ability to avoid detection for so long can be attributed to several factors. Firstly, his choice of victims was often random, making it difficult to link his crimes. He targeted both men and women, of all ages, with no clear pattern to his selection. This lack of consistency made it hard for investigators to recognize that they were dealing with the same killer. Secondly, Keyes was careful to leave no physical evidence behind. He was extremely cautious when handling his victims and the crime scene, ensuring that he didn't leave any fingerprints or DNA. He even went so far as to clean up after his murders, erasing any trace that might lead back to him. Another key aspect of Keyes's success in evading capture was his ability to manipulate the police investigation. He was highly intelligent and understood how law enforcement operated. He often stayed several steps ahead of investigators, controlling the information he gave and misdirecting them when they got too close. Keyes enjoyed the game of cat and mouse with the police, taking pleasure in keeping them in the dark for as long as possible. He would give them just enough information to keep them chasing falls, while withholding the crucial details that could have led to his arrest. In addition, Keyes was strategic about how he disposed of his victims. He would transport their bodies to remote areas, sometimes burying them in shallow graves or dumping them in lakes or rivers, ensuring that they wouldn't be discovered for years. One of his favorite methods was to place his victims' bodies in water, where the natural elements would obscure the evidence of his crimes. This strategy made it even harder for authorities to piece together a coherent timeline of his murders. The gruesome crimes of Israel. Key. Israel Keyes's killing spree spanned several years, marked by chilling precision, meticulous planning, and a complete lack of remorse. Below are the confirmed victims of Israel Keyes, whose brutal murders were ultimately uncovered, along with the details of each case. Deborah Feldman's New Jersey, 2009. The first confirmed murder of Israel Keyes took place in 2009, though he claimed to have killed long before that. Keyes abducted and likely killed Deborah Feldman, a 49-year-old woman from New Jersey. Her disappearance marked the beginning of Keyes's killing spree. Although her body was never found, investigators have strong reasons to believe that she was one of Keyes's early victims. Keyes confessed to abducting her and likely murdering her, although he did not provide full details about her death. The case remains open, with ongoing efforts to connect her disappearance with Keyes's known timeline of murders. Bill and Lorraine Currier, Tomas, Vermont, 2011. In 2011, Bill and Lorraine Currier, a married couple from Vermont, became the victims of one of Keyes's most brutal killings. Keyes later confessed to stalking the local police to determine the best time to commit the crime. Initially, he intended to ransom the couple, but the plan changed when they fought back. Keyes tied Bill to a chair, and when he resisted, Keyes bludgeoned him with a shovel and shot him dead in front of his wife. Lorraine tried to escape but was caught, raped, and strangled with a cord. Their bodies were disposed of in a remote location, buried in a secret place Keyes refused to reveal until it was strategically beneficial for him to do so. Although Keyes's confession and the crime scene linked him to the murder, the location of the bodies has never been disclosed, leaving the remains of Bill and Lorraine Currier lost to this day. This case raised suspicions: did Keyes want to be caught? His increasing risk-taking and mistakes suggested that he may have been growing reckless or seeking attention. Samantha Koenig's Alaska, 2012. The abduction and murder of Samantha Koenig in 2012 was the crime that ultimately led to Keyes's arrest. While Israel Keyes was eventually apprehended and convicted for several murders, many other potential victims remain unidentified. Keyes's disturbing pattern of random killings and his ability to evade detection for years make it difficult to definitively link him to every case. Julie Harris, Washington, 1996. Julie Harris, a 12-year-old girl, disappeared in 1996 from Washington. The case remains open, and Keyes's name came up during the investigation when he admitted to knowing about her case, although he denied being involved. Julie's remains were eventually found, but no evidence has connected Keyes to her disappearance. Julie's disappearance, however, fits Keyes' known pattern of abducting young women, and his apparent familiarity with the case raises suspicions. Julie's case remains a possible cold case, and further investigation into Keyes' connection to her disappearance might shed light on his early crimes. In addition to the murders, Israel Keyes committed a series of other crimes: bank robberies to fund his travels and killings, arson, theft, kidnapping, sexual assaults, and torture of victims. Keyes' ability to blend into society while carrying out his violent acts made him particularly dangerous. He used his military background and meticulous planning to stay ahead of law enforcement. Marlene and Cassandra Emerson, unknown location, 1997. Marlene and Cassandra Emerson, a mother and daughter, were found murdered after their home was burned down. While Keyes' direct involvement has not been proven, the nature of the crime, combined with his behavior and known movements at the time, has led authorities to consider him a suspect. The house fire and the double homicide have characteristics similar to other crimes Keyes later admitted to. There is no definitive proving Keyes to the Emerson case, but the similarities in the modus operandi of his other killings make it a possibility. The lack of direct evidence, such as DNA or other forensic links, leaves this case unresolved. Suzanne Lilal was a 19th and appeared from New York in 1998. She had been last seen walking home, and her disappearance remains unsolved to this day. Keyes, during his interrogations, did not explicitly confess to killing Lyle, but he was active in the area around the time of her disappearance. Additionally, Lyle's body has never been found, and her case shares similarities with other victims. Keyes later confessed to killing. While there is no concrete evidence linking Keyes to Lylal's disappearance, the timing of her abduction, combined with his travel patterns, makes her a potential victim. Investigators continue to review her case, considering the possibility that Keyes may have been involved, particularly given his history of abducting and killing young women. Lauren Spearer, a 20-year-old college student, went missing in Indiana in 2011. She was last seen walking home after a night out with friends. Keyes was reportedly in Indiana around the time of Spearer's disappearance, and this connection has led some to suspect his involvement. Despite extensive searches, Lauren's body has never been found, and there is no forensic evidence to definitively link her case to Keyes. However, investigators have continued to explore possible links, especially considering Keyes' ability to travel extensively across the country and his history of abducting and killing young women. Given Keyes' confession to multiple murders, it remains a possibility that Lauren Spearer could have been one of his victims. Gilbert Gilman, a man who went missing in 2006, was last seen in a remote area near Keyes' residence in Alaska. Gilman was known to have been in the vicinity of Keyes' home during the time he disappeared. While no direct evidence connects Keyes to Gilman's disappearance, the proximity and the circumstances surrounding his vanishing have raised suspicions that Keyes may have been involved. As with many other suspected cases, Gilman's body has never been found, and no clear motive or forensic evidence has been uncovered linking Keyes directly to the crime. This case remains one of the many unsolved disappearances that investigators are now revisiting in light of Keyes' confessions. A chilling aspect of Israel Keyes' crimes was his ability to conceal and destroy the bodies of his victims to avoid detection. His methods were highly methodical, and he took great care to dispose of the bodies in locations that would make it difficult for investigators to recover them. Keyes often chose waterways, rivers, lakes, and other bodies of water to dispose of bodies. His use of water allowed him to hide the remains in a way that was difficult for investigators to detect. Water-based disposal also made it harder for authorities to recover evidence, as the bodies would be subject to the natural elements and currents, which could distort or destroy forensic evidence. Keyes also preferred to dispose of bodies in remote and isolated locations. Whether it was a shallow grave, remote forest area, or desolate field, Keyes selected places far from his home and away from major highways or towns. This ensured the bodies would remain undisturbed for long periods, making it more difficult for authorities to link the crime scenes together. These secluded areas were Keyes' choice, because they allowed him to commit his crimes with minimal risk of detection. In some cases, Keyes used arson to destroy evidence. He would set fire to structures or vehicles to cover up his tracks, particularly when he needed to destroy belongings or other evidence linked to a victim. Arson was another tool in his arsenal, adding complexity to the investigation, as it effectively wiped out traces that could connect him to the crime. One of the most disturbing aspects of Keyes's killings was of dismembering the bodies of his victims. Keyes admitted that, in some cases, he would cut up the bodies and dispose of the parts separately, making it even harder for investigators to identify the victims and connect the murders to him. For example, in the case of Samantha Koenig, after he murdered her, he dismembered her body, which he later disposed of in various locations. Keyes revealed that he cut her body into pieces, and then threw the parts into a lake, using the water to further complicate efforts to recover her remains and identify her. This is another reason why her body was never immediately found after her murder. Keyes's crimes spanned the United States and beyond, with suspected victims in many places. Green River, Wyoming. Keyes buried one of his kill kits near the Green River, Wyoming. While no body has been found at this location, the presence of the kill kit suggests that a victim could have been buried nearby. Investigators are still looking into the possibility that Keyes buried a victim in this area, but no forensic evidence has been uncovered so far. Healdsburg, California. In 2007, Keyes rented a kayak in Healdsburg, California, and it's suspected that he may have used it to dispose of a victim's body in the nearby Russian River. The kayak rental is an important clue, but no body has been found to confirm this. The proximity of the Russian River makes this area a prime candidate for Keyes's water-based disposal method. Montreal, Canada. Keyes alludes to having killed in Canada, stating that Canadians don't count. While no direct evidence has been found linking him to any crimes in Canada, his cryptic admission and his known ability to travel across borders suggest that he may have had victims in the country. Further investigations into missing persons cases in Montreal and other areas are ongoing, though no bodies have been recovered or linked to Keyes. Alcan Highway. Keyes traveled extensively along the Alcan Highway, which connects Canada to Alaska. The route passes through remote, uninhabited areas, making it a prime location for body disposal. While no bodies have been definitively tied to this highway, Keyes's frequent travel along this road suggests that he may have used it to dispose of victims in isolated spots, far from any major population centers. This adds another layer of mystery to his killing spree, as the remote locations along the highway would have allowed him to carry out his murders without fear of detection. The final crime of Israel, Keyes. The last victim of Israel Keyes is Samantha Koenig. Unlike his previous victims, Keyes chose to strike close to home, and, even more chillingly, he carried out the crime within his own property. In the hours leading up to the kidnapping, Keyes prepared the scene in his home. He turned on the space heater in his shed, laid down a plastic tarp on the floor, and made sure the area was ready for his crime. Keyes, who had always operated with strict control, was about to break one of his own rules, getting too close to his home and family. After attacking Samantha, Keyes drove her to his home, where he locked her in the shed, a chilling location just yards away from where his wife and daughter lived. He turned on loud music in the shed and threatened to kill her if she screamed. After gaining access to her debit card, Keyes broke into her boyfriend's house and took the card. He then returned to the shed, raped and strangled Samantha to death. Samantha Koenig was murdered on February 1, 2012. However, an illogical detail here. The message directed Samantha's family to Corner Park went with a photograph of Samantha holding a local newspaper public dated February 13, 2012. In the picture, Samantha appeared to be alive, her eyes were wide. What really happened? Keyes had used a needle and thread to stitch her eyelids open, made her appear alive, and then staged the photo with the newspaper. After the death of Samantha, Keyes went on a vacation with his family, leaving Samantha's lifeless body hidden in his shed. Keyes withdrew money from Samantha's bank account at various ATMs across the country, traveling to Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. It was this trail of withdrawals that ultimately led to his capture. A Texas Ranger noticed his suspicious vehicle, a white Ford Focus, and the authorities tracked it back to Keyes. When Keyes was arrested on March 13, 2012, law enforcement had no idea they were dealing with a serial killer. Initially, they believed it was just a kidnapping gone wrong. However, during questioning, Keyes made a shocking confession. He was not just a kidnapper, but a serial killer who had been operating for years. He revealed that he had killed multiple victims from 1996 to 2012, carefully planning each crime and taking breaks between his murders to avoid detection. His cold and calculated nature made him one of the most dangerous criminals the FBI had ever encountered. The investigation of FBI. After Israel Keyes was arrested, the FBI began a meticulous investigation into his crimes. One of the most chilling discoveries was a Series 11 skull drawings made with Keyes' own blood, hidden under his mattress in his jail cell. The FBI believes these drawings represent the total number of victims Keyes had killed, with only 4 victims identified so far: Samantha Koenig-Bill and Lorraine Courier, and Deborah Feldman. These drawings serve as a haunting reminder of his capacity for violence and control, and the number of victims may still be higher. The FBI employed a strategy known as befriending, where agents feigned friendliness and CERN to encourage Keyes to open up. Over the course of 7 months, they engaged him in casual conversations, offering him cigars, coffee, and Snickers to break his resistance. Their approach worked, and Keyes eventually provided 24 voluntary confessions. However, he still withheld crucial details, often misdirecting investigators, making the investigation both frustrating and challenging. Keyes enjoyed the power dynamic in the interrogation, and his ability to control the flow of information made him a formidable adversary. Keyes' psychological profile revealed him to be a highly intelligent and coldly methodical individual with a history of antisocial personality disorder. His crimes were methodical and planned, and he reveled in the ability to remain undetected for so long. Keyes was not just a serial killer, he was a manipulative predator who played mind games with law enforcement, feeding them just enough to keep them chasing false leads. Keyes idolized Ted Bundy, considering him a role model for his own criminal activities. He admired Bundy's ability to blend into society while committing his gruesome crimes, and he aspired to be a better version of Bundy, more intelligent and less likely to get caught. In his own words, Keyes described himself as having 2 personalities. One social, capable of blending into normal society, and the other homicidal, driven by the urge to kill. His ultimate goal was not only to kill but to live without ever being caught. This reflected the terrifying coldness and detachment that defined his psyche. Keyes' chilling acts also extended to necrophilia. He admitted to performing necrophilic acts with the body of Samantha Koenig, showing just how deep his psychological disorder went. He had no clear motive or grudge against his victims. He didn't kill because of hatred or material gain. He killed because it brought him pleasure and allowed him to exert power over his victims, in a way that made him feel invincible. This lack of emotional attachment to his victims made him even more dangerous than many other serial killers. Keyes' behavior during his interrogation demonstrated his manipulative nature. He used the room as a stage, carefully controlling the flow of information. He found pleasure in keeping investigators in the dark, dragging out the process of revealing details, and making them work for every piece of information. On December 2, 2012, just months after his arrest, Keyes' death closed the door on a terrifying chapter of American criminal history. He had eluded justice for years, living a double life, one as a family man and the other as a brutal serial killer. Despite his confession to several murders, the full extent of his crimes may never be uncovered. The case of Israel Keyes serves as a chilling reminder of how deeply ingrained psychopathy can be, and how manipulation and control can allow a killer to slip through the cracks for years. The key takeaway from his case is that serial killers often hide in plain sight, and the true danger lies in their ability to blend into society while harboring horrific secrets. Vigilance and thorough investigation are crucial to preventing such individuals from continuing their reign of terror. In 1978, a handsome, charming man walked onto the stage of a popular American TV show, The Dating Game. With a confident smile and quick wit, he wooed the bachelorette and won the date. The audience cheered. But no one knew they were applauding a serial killer. This man was Rodney Alcala. Behind his charming looking was a man with a monstrous secret. By the time he stepped onto that stage, he had already raped, tortured, and murdered multiple women, and he wasn't done yet. How did a man with a violent criminal past pass background checks and appear on national television? How did he fool not only producers, but judge doctors and parole boards for over a decade? This is the story of a predator who used his intelligence to hunt. A man the FBI would later describe as a killing machine disguised as a gentleman. And the scariest part, we still don't know how many victims there really were. This is the story of Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. Early life and the first attack. Rodney Alcala was born in 1943 in San Antonio, Texas, under the name Rodrigo Jacques Alcala Bucor. When he was 11, his father left the family, and his mother moved Rodney and his two younger sisters to Los Angeles. There, Rodney was seen as a bright and charismatic, attractive, self-assured, and sociable. On the surface, he was the kind of teenager people admired. At 17, he joined the U.S. Army, stationed at Fort Bragg. Though he dreamed of becoming a paratrooper, he worked instead as a clerk. In 1963, he abruptly left the base without authorization, hitchhiking cross-country back to California. He was soon located and given a psychiatric evaluation, the diagnosis, antisocial personality disorder, chronic and severe. Despite this, Alcala received an honorable discharge. After the military, Alcala studied fine arts at UCLA and then, under the name John Berger, enrolled in the NYU Film School in New York. There, he honed his skills in photography, skills he would later misuse to gain the trust of unsuspecting individuals. In 1968, Alcala targeted his first known victim, 8-year-old Tali Shapiro, in Los Angeles. He approached her on the street, claiming to know her parents and even showing her fake photos. He convinced her to enter his car and brought her to his apartment. A witness, sensing something was wrong, followed them and alerted police. Officer Chris Camacho arrived and knocked. Alcala appeared at the door, claiming to be getting dressed after a shower, though he was completely dry. He used the delay to slip out the back. Inside, Camacho found Tali severely injured and unconscious. She survived, but required weeks in the hospital and a lengthy recovery. In the apartment, officers found numerous troubling photographs involving minors. With Alcala on the run, the FBI added him to their 10 most wanted list. A predator had slipped away, and this was just the beginning. A serial killer's in disguise. After the brutal attack on 8-year-old Tali Shapiro in 1968, Rodney Alcala vanished. Using the name John Berger, he fled across the country to New York City. Under this new identity, he enrolled at NYU's film school, studying photography and blending effortlessly with artists and students. No one suspected a thing. In 1971, Alcala crossed a fatal line. He met Cornelia Crilly, a 23-year-old TWA flight attendant who had just moved into a new apartment. Alcala offered to help her with furniture. That same day, Cornelia was found deceased in her apartment. She had been restrained, and there were clear bite marks on her body. The case would go cold for nearly 4 decades. At the time, DNA analysis wasn't available, and John Berger slipped away. He soon took a job as a camp counselor in New Hampshire, working directly with young girls. But his past caught up. 2 students spotted his face on a most wanted poster at a local post office. They told the camp authorities, and within days, FBI agents arrested him. Back in California, prosecutors wanted justice. But Tali Shapiro's family declined to have her testify. With no main witness, Alcala accepted a plea deal for a reduced charge. He served just 34 months, less than 3 years. Once released, he was arrested again for being with a 13-year-old girl and possessing illicit substances, this time serving about 2.5 years. And in June 1977, incredibly, he was granted permission by his parole officer to travel back to New York. There, he targeted Ellen Hover, the daughter of a Hollywood nightclub owner. On the day she disappeared, her calendar read, "Lunch with John Berger." Her body was found nearly a year later at Rockefeller Preserve. But by then, Alcala had already returned to Los Angeles, vanishing once again, hiding in plain sight. His daring went even further after that. On September 13, 1978, Rodney Alcala walked onto a soundstage in Los Angeles to appear on The Dating Game, America's most popular reality dating show at the time. The format was simple. One woman would ask flirtatious questions to 3 hidden bachelors and pick her favorite for a dream date. Alcala was introduced to the audience as a successful photographer who enjoys skydiving and motorcycle riding, and who got his start when his father found him in the darkroom at the age of 13. Fully developed. The man the producers cast that day was using his real name, Rodney Alcala. He was charming, confident, and by all appearances, just another bachelor looking for love. No one seemed to know that he was also a registered sex offender with a violent criminal past. No background check was ever done. He was chosen simply because he looked good on camera. During the taping, Alcala made several innuendo-laced jokes. When asked what kind of food he would be, he responded with a grin, "I'm called the banana, and I look really good. Peel me?" The audience laughed. Cheryl smiled but uncomfortably. Behind the curtain, the warning signs were everywhere. Another contestant later recalled that Alcala was cold, avoided eye contact, and seemed intensely competitive. Just before filming, he had leaned in and said, "I always get the girl." It wasn't just confidence, possessive, aggressive, and unnerving. On stage, Alcala came across as witty, bold, and full of confidence, exactly what a 1970s-era dating show rewarded. At the time, Cheryl Bradshaw had no visual contact with any of the contestants. She based her decision solely on their voices and wordplay, and ultimately chose Alcala as the winner. But once backstage, her instincts screamed that something was wrong. Cheryl would later say his energy was dark, that he gave her a creepy feeling. His presence felt off. She immediately told producers she didn't want to go on the date. That decision may have saved her life. That day, millions of Americans watched a serial predator win a dating game, and no one had a clue who he really was. The end of the killing spree. Back to the killing spree. It seems like Alcala never have any gap year in his crime. Right before the dating game, he committed another kill. Jill Barcom, just 18 years old, had recently moved to California from New York in late 1977. One evening, after reportedly leaving a party, she vanished. Her body was found dumped in the Hollywood Hills, face down, unclothed, with signs of blunt force trauma and strangulation. After the dating game, his spree kept lasting. Georgia Wickstead, 27, was a dedicated nurse living alone in Malibu. In December 1977, she was found dead in her apartment. She had been beaten with a blunt object, then strangled with her own socks. The scene showed signs of a struggle and sexual assault. Charlotte Lamb, 32, worked as a secretary and lived in El Segundo. In June 1978, her body was discovered in the laundry room of her apartment building. She had been stripped, her hands tied behind her back, and strangled with a telephone cord. There were no signs of forced entry, which led investigators to believe she had either been lured or ambushed. Jill Parenteau, 21, was a college student in Burbank. In June 1979, she failed to show up for class and wasn't answering calls. Concerned friends visited her apartment and found a horrific scene, signs of forced entry, broken objects, and Jill's lifeless body. But it was Robin Samsoe, just 12 years old, who would finally lead police to Rodney Alcala and end his freedom. Robin lived in Huntington Beach, California. She was full of energy, loved ballet, and had recently been accepted into an acting program. On June 20, 1979, she left a friend's house to ride her bike to a ballet class. Along the way, she was approached by a man offering to take her picture, using the same method Alcala had used before. Robin never made it to class. Her friend, who had been with her shortly before the encounter, gave police a detailed description of the man. A composite sketch was drawn and circulated. Soon after, a parole officer recognized the image. It was Rodney Alcala. Police arrested him at his mother's house in Monterey Park. 12 days after her disappearance, Robin's remains were discovered in the foothills of the Sierra Madre Mountains. The body was badly decomposed, scattered by wildlife. But it was enough. The horror was real, and finally undeniable. Investigation, trial, and aftermath. After Rodney Alcala was arrested in connection with the disappearance of 12-year-old Robin Samsoe, detectives quickly began to search through his belongings. Inside one of Alcala's bags, they discovered a receipt for a rented storage locker in Seattle, Washington. Detectives obtained a warrant and searched the unit. What they uncovered shocked even seasoned investigators. Over 1,000 photographs of women, teenage girls, and children. Many posed in disturbing or vulnerable positions. These weren't casual portraits. They looked methodical, calculated. Among the contents was a pink silk pouch filled with women's jewelry. But one item in particular stopped the case in its tracks: a pair of gold earrings. Robin Samsoe's mother identified them immediately. They were the exact earrings Robin had worn on the day she vanished. Alcala couldn't explain how they ended up in his possession, and that pink pouch became the single most damning piece of physical evidence tying him to Robin's murder. But it didn't end there. Investigators began sending DNA samples, collected from cold case homicides in the 1970s, for comparison. The results were chilling. Rodney Alcala's DNA matched 4 unsolved murders: Jill Barcombe, Georgia Wickstead, Charlotte Lamb, and Jill Parenteau. These were women who had been killed years apart, in different cities, with varying methods, yet the same man connected them all. Alcala was brought in for repeated questioning. He denied ever being near the scenes, changed stories, and deflected responsibility. When asked about the earrings, he had no answer. When shown photos of Christine Thornton, another woman later confirmed dead, he stared at the image for several minutes, slowly tracing her body with his finger. He didn't speak. He just stared. In one interrogation, he finally said, "She was alive when I left." That was the closest he ever came to an admission. With mounting evidence and 5 murder charges on the table, prosecutors began preparing for trial. With DNA, photographs, and a trail of victims dating back nearly a decade, this wasn't just a single murder case anymore. It was now a serial homicide investigation, spanning states, years, and countless lives lost. Witnesses were called back: Robin's friend who last saw her alive, her mother, the parole officer who recognized Alcala's sketch. The court was shown some of the photos from the Seattle storage locker, but only those deemed appropriate, as many were too graphic to be presented publicly. Rodney Alcala's journey through the legal system was as drawn out and complex as his list of victims was long. His first trial began in March 1980 for the kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Robin Samsoe. By June, he was convicted and sentenced to death, but the verdict didn't hold. In 1984, a California appeals court overturned the conviction, citing that the jury had been exposed to inadmissible information about Alcala's prior sex crimes. He was retried in 1986 and once again sentenced to death. But in 2001, that conviction too was overturned, this time due to procedural errors involving a key witness. Twice, justice had slipped through the cracks. It wasn't until 2010 that justice finally caught up. In his third and final trial, Alcala was charged not just with Robin Samsoe's murder, but with 4 additional murders from the 1970s. He chose to act as his own attorney, cross-examined witnesses including Robin's grieving mother, and even played music in the courtroom, his now infamous Alice's Restaurant moment. On March 25, he was convicted on all 5 counts. 5 days later, he was sentenced to death for the 3rd time. But that wasn't the end. In 2013, Alcala pleaded guilty to 2 more murders in New York: Cornelia Crilly and Ellen Hover, cold cases that had finally been linked to him through DNA and a calendar entry listing the alias, John Berger. In 2015, he was also charged in Wyoming for the 1977 murder of Christine Thornton after her remains were identified through a photograph and DNA. He was never extradited due to his declining health and existing death sentence in California. Alcala spent the remainder of his life on death row at San Quentin Prison. California had placed a moratorium on executions, meaning Alcala was never executed despite receiving 3 death sentences. In July 2021, he died of natural causes at the age of 77, never expressing remorse, never taking full responsibility for what he had done. In the years following his final conviction, the FBI and LAPD released more than 120 photographs found in his Seattle storage unit, asking for the public's help in identifying the women and children in the images. Some were later confirmed to be alive, but dozens remain unidentified to this day. Many investigators believe Alcala's true victim count may number between 100 and 130. Culturally, Rodney Alcala became known as the dating game killer, thanks to his eerie appearance on the 1978 television show during the height of his killing spree. His case inspired documentaries, books, dramatizations, and podcasts. He became a disturbing symbol of how charm, intelligence, and a photogenic smile can mask something unimaginably evil. Remaining questions. Even after his death, Rodney Alcala leaves behind a trail of unanswered questions. Was Rodney Alcala's appearance on television just a bizarre coincidence? Or was it something far more deliberate? Some have speculated that it a private social experiment. He didn't use a fake name. He made no effort to conceal his identity. He knew background checks weren't part of the process, so he walked onto the dating game as if daring the world to look closer. Many people also wondered were all of his victims ever found. Some speculate that among the unidentified women in his infamous photo collection are not just missing persons, but possibly women tied to the entertainment world, maybe even daughters of powerful families, silenced, their stories buried deeper than any evidence could reach. And then there's the question of Alcala himself. Was he simply lucky? Or was he one of the most intelligent and manipulative serial killers of the modern era? With an estimated IQ over 135, a photographic memory, and the ability to outmaneuver lawyers, judges, and psychiatrists for years, the possibility is hard to ignore. In the end, we may never know the full extent of what Rodney Alcala did or who he truly was. The case of Rodney Alcala is not just a story about a killer, it's a mirror held up to our systems, our blind spots, and even our fascination with appearances. It shows us how easily evil can wear a mask, how charm, intelligence, and a photogenic smile can disarm not just individuals, but entire institutions. This case also reminds us that justice, when delayed, risks becoming diluted. Alcala's victims waited decades for their names to be spoken in court. Some may never be known. Others are still waiting to be identified in forgotten photographs. In the end, the truth doesn't always come quickly, but it must come eventually.